Welcome to another episode of Start, Grow and Monetise Your Podcast with me, Alex Chisnell, and him,
James Burr. Hi there.
Welcome to the show.
New studio, by the way, for anyone who's watching, new studio.
Do you like it?
There's been a whole story around why there's a new studio, but we are here. We're here in Poole. We've sea dipped. We've had a lovely little time. I'm going to move to Poole.
Okay, that's good.
That's been the biggest outcome that I've learned from this trip.
Well,
I need to move to Poole.
Well, we don't know. We have to put that before the committee.
Fine. Who is the committee? Is it just you?
It's just me. Right, today we're talking about mastering the art of podcast growth.
We are.
Okay. And we want you to master your own podcast growth, whether you started your podcast or are thinking about starting your podcast, okay? So first thing I'm gonna ask you about is understanding your audience. So what does your data tell you about their preferences and how can you leverage that data?
Yeah, this is really interesting. So me and you sat down after walking around a beautiful sunset beach last night. It sounds very romantic our day. We had a sunset, we had a sunrise. I mean, it's been a lovely
We've had it all, mate.
We've had it all. But we were sat in a pub last night and you'd broken down some of the stats related to this podcast. You did, you? I've been looking at the stats. Someone in that pub had a breakdown, hadn't they? My God, they were living their best life. My goodness. Anyway, story for another time. And you had looked at all of the data across YouTube and across Spotify and across Apple Podcasts. And what was really, we'll break down the stats of this podcast in another episode because I think it's useful to understand what the data tells you, what the numbers look like, and then how you can sort of attribute that and then make sure you're making the right decisions moving forwards. But it's things like you can see, for example, where your listeners are coming from. You can see their broad age range. You can see, if you're looking at things like YouTube, for example, drop-off rates. Mm-hmm. So, for example, and you can see the same thing in podcast platforms as well, depending on which RSS feed you're using, whether you're on Spotify for Creators or Libsyn or Buzzsprout or Podbean or Captivate, they will show you a bunch of stats. Now, some is better than others. Spotify for Creators, I find it really good for Spotify data, really limited on everything else.
Funny that.
Which you kind of expect from them. Whereas Captivate, for example, gives you really good data across the board because it's agnostic. It's not platform specific. It's not trying to push one particular place to you more than anything else. But just from looking at even the basic information, you can see cities, locations, geographies, gender, platforms that you're on. So, for example, if you've got more listeners on Apple than you have on Spotify, you've probably got an audience that skews slightly older than younger. And then you can make decisions. So, for example, we looked, I think it was like 70% of our audience is based in the UK. So moving forwards, we know we can, if we want to try and grow that audience, we've got one or two choices to make. We can either try and go after an audience that's not the UK and try and increase that sort of geographical spread, or we can double down and go, do you know what? Actually, there's a lot of UK listeners, which we kind of expected anyway.
Yeah.
Why don't we make more UK specific content? But we'd only know that from the data because otherwise you're guessing. And what I always say to clients is use the data to act on fact, because otherwise you're just making opinions based on which direction the wind's blowing in. And I get loads of clients, I know you do as well, who might come to you and say, oh, we want to do a test episode. Do you get this? Like, we want to do one episode to see how it goes. Like, you're going to learn nothing from one episode. You're going to learn absolutely nothing from one episode. You might learn from doing the recording. You might see, does social media pick it up? Do you get good engagement? You might see that for sure. But in terms of podcast data, you're going to get nothing from it. So whether you're, as I say, Captivate, Buzzsprout, Podbean, Spotify for Creators, whether you're doing it directly through Apple or Libsyn or whichever platform, go back regularly to your stats and your data and just have a read through the basic top line stuff it shows you. And then you can make decisions on which direction to take your podcast in.
And look, it's easy to become obsessed by this kind of stuff with the data, but equally, it's also easy to completely forget about it once you launch a podcast and you just get focused on the maelstrom of it becomes a marketing exercise. So it's literally just like, what are we putting out on Instagram, Facebook, TikTok, LinkedIn, etc.
Yeah.
And we were, this is
we're a bit guilty of it, weren't we?
Exactly.
Really?
That's what I'm trying to articulate. We're a bit guilty of it as well.
You're trying to skirt it.
But we've said we need to get together every month. It's not like Diary of a CEO, we're going to look at this every day, for example.
Every hour.
and tweak something.
Every minute.
The 1% changes. But what we can do is meet up once a month for 60 to 90 minutes and just go through the data and pick one thing that we can change. Keep everything else the same. I was chatting with our good friend Piers Linney about this the other day, what he was tweaking with his LinkedIn. He was saying, literally, for doing something like this exercise, change one thing. keep everything else the same, and then you can see what difference it makes. If you try and change, and I'm guilty of this, trying to change 3 or 4 things at the same time, you have no idea what you changed.
Oh, something works.
Something works.
One of the 10 things I changed. Yeah.
Exactly.
And to your point there, to circle back, and if you're sort of sitting there going, well, I haven't got the time of a diary of a CEO, I can't be high performance, I'm not Fern Cotton, I haven't got a full-time team on this. Okay, well, allocate your time, and let's maybe say, for example, you can look at your data once per month and go, right, what are the 4 changes that I can make for this month? And you change 1 thing per week.
Correct.
Or if you're super limited on time, just change 1 thing for that entire month. And then you circle back in April and you look again. You change 1 more thing, like let's change the thumbnails. You circle back again, let's change the titles. You circle back again, let's change links in show notes.
Another thing, let's change the co-host.
I mean, don't do that, guys. Never do that.
But we need to do this. We will do this, okay? And we'll feed back to you on what changes we've made, and how that works out for us. Something else I want to touch on is platform-specific strategies. Easy for me to say. So, looking at growing differently on YouTube versus audio, and again, it was something that we looked at last night, and I see this with a lot of podcasts, in that your audience on YouTube is completely different to your audience on audio. And we looked at ours, and we'll go through this in another episode, but basically, YouTube, our audience was 97% male versus, I think it was 40% female, 60% male on audio. And you're like, well, okay. And also, like with the countries, so 70% audio for UK, YouTube video only 18% UK, and you kind of look
Ireland
at the bigger picture.
Was the biggest platform, wasn't it?
Which
randomly,
is
Ireland,
totally
US,
randomly.
and then UK. I think it was.
Yeah, but you look at it. Second biggest search engine in the world is YouTube, owned by Google. So it's kind of like, no shit, Sherlock, it's going to have a way bigger reach, and it can get skewed more easily than audio, which it's it's a lot slower, I think, to gain that kind of traction. I remember reading something before that 7 out of every 10 new podcast listeners are coming through YouTube. So only 3 out of 10 are coming through audio.
Really?
Who discovers?
Wow,
discovering.
that is interesting.
And you just think, well, discoveries, there's far more ways to discover podcasts through YouTube. And again, it's, keywords in the title, keywords in the episode title, keywords in the episode description, all those kinds of things, which you're going to get with audio. But you look at video, and you've got thumbnails as another one, which is obviously a very visual thing, what you're attracted to and what one person is attracted to. Another person isn't. So, platform-specific strategies, growing differently on YouTube versus audio platforms. Anything you'd like to add to that as well?
Well, the only other thing I'd say now is when you're looking at audio versus, it's really interesting, audio versus YouTube, you keep saying. But it's actually audio versus video. And previously, it was only YouTube or like Vimeo. But that's, pretty much non-existent, isn't it, frankly? That's used for, like, production companies for, like, super, mega high-res video files. The only other addition now is Spotify for creators. And Spotify for creators, I think, in terms of the discoverability thing, like you said, with Apple, for years, and with all of the platforms for years and years, you go onto a podcast and you just accidentally find it's either going to be a keyword that you search for, that might rank because of the show name, the show title, the episode description, wherever it may be, or you just resonate with the artwork, or you might find it in a curated category, or a new and noteworthy, or a top 50 chart, or whatever it may be. But now Spotify are actually showing these little clips in discoverability. So, and a pal of mine the other day was listening to other stuff, and a clip from a podcast I'm involved in popped up on his feed, and he went, "Oh, look who's come up." It's really interesting because he was listening to Diary of a CEO, High Performance, Alex Hormozy, and this was a suggested, based on your listening, you might also like this show, which was the business broadcast I do with our mutual friend James Sinclair. So that definitely works because, and what's really interesting with Spotify for creators, I need to do a bit more digging into it now. When you upload the video, how I perceived it to work was that Spotify for creators will pull a section using AI, makes sense, right? It will pull a section, it will show a 30-second or a 60-second clip of your podcast in sort of portrait format, like an Instagram reel, one clip. But then when I went back in for a show that I've been helping my wife with, when I went back in to look at some of the data, I went into the actual specific episode, and it gave you the ability to choose a clip.
Yeah, I didn't know that.
And I thought, okay, that's interesting. So then I added just a single clip, of one of them speakers. There's 4 sort of female business entrepreneurs. So it's like, let me try one which is a clip of just one person saying something, and then I'll try the trailer and see if that works well. Because you often find trailers, you know, unless you're doing very good Power Ant Smith, an effort like that with like a Diary of a CEO, I find that trailers get so much less reach than just individual clips.
Yeah.
And you're putting so much more time, effort, energy, production value into those things. So I'm just testing all that stuff out. So maybe I'll do a little walkthrough, and we'll put that out as an episode as well. I'll actually go into the back end of Spotify for creators and show how to set that up in the right way. Because I think Spotify's discoverability is going to be the start of lots of platforms going in that direction. Because otherwise, Apple, Castbox, SoundCloud,
it's tough.
I think they're going to struggle, and I think Spotify's going to eat their lunch.
Yeah, no, same. And there doesn't seem to be a reaction, but another podcast episode for that one.
Yes.
Okay, so what about, so we're talking, mastering the art of podcast audience growth. To grow your audience, think about the different formats that work. We obviously have two of us having a conversation. You can have solo episodes, you can have guest episodes, you can have panel discussions. What else can people try? What other ones have I missed that you think people could try for formats?
I think you've pretty much got all of them there. The only thing, if you're making content in other platforms, you could repurpose that content, especially now that video is becoming a big thing. So like, for example, if you give a keynote, I hear Alex Hormozy do this all the time. His podcast is basically him ripping off audio from other things that he's doing. So it might be a keynote he's doing for school. It might be a keynote he's doing for
Gary
video.
Vee's the same, isn't it?
Yeah, Gary Vee's the same. And they're just basically repurposing that content. I had a client of ours who would repurpose loads of his video content, and then I said, well, why don't you do it the other way around? Other way round? Sound like Jonathan Ross. The other way round, because what you'd end up finding is if you can repurpose from other platforms, you just need to make sure that it's still almost platform agnostic. So don't hey, if you do the live feed, morning Mary, morning Jane, hey Jim, how are you? And he used to have those bits in his podcast like, dude, you've got to stop referencing people individually, because what you're then doing for that audience who's listening to the podcast, he was getting 6,000 to 10,000 downloads a month, so it was no small show. I was like, you need to repurpose the other way around. Do your podcast and your video, and then maybe do that on a live premiere on Facebook if you have a big audience on Facebook, which he did, not the other way around. So if you are going to repurpose, just make sure that it still works as individual content. But again, the one thing I would say, as we talk about growing an audience here, test and measure, because you might find the stuff that you don't like doing. So many people that I work with, they're quite happy to do a guest episode straight off the bat. Like, never done a podcast before, cool, I'll interview someone. As soon as you say to them, we'll do a solo episode, everyone bricks it.
Yeah, everyone goes silent.
And I get it, because I did it, the first one that I ever recorded, it took me an hour to record it, 2 hours to edit it, and it ended up being 15 minutes worth of content. I was like, oh my God, I can't do this every episode. And I hated it. And I'd been on the radio, so I'd been used to talking to no one, pretending there was an audience listening. I mean, I hope there was an audience listening on the radio, but there probably wasn't.
Devious.
Yeah, tumbleweed. So I get why it's difficult, but in that format there, you might find that that's the stuff that your audience really, really resonates with.
And off the back of that, interestingly enough, again, with my podcast, Screw It, Just Do It, I waited till I had no choice, i.e.
Someone dropped out. Your backlog of pre-recorded episodes were gone.
All gone, mate. So I had to do a solo episode, or interview somebody in the street, just walk out of my house and grab somebody. So I did a solo episode.
With your wife again. Tell me about breakfast this morning. Fuck off, we do.
But interestingly, to this day, like 8 years later, that was from nearly the end of the first year that I started recording. That is still in the top 10 most downloaded episodes.
Yeah, there you go.
And that led to me doing a solo episode every week for about 5 years, till I literally thought I've run out of things to say when it comes to small business, entrepreneurship. And yes, I could go again now because there's been a few years gap, but the motivation isn't there to do that. And I've seen other podcasters do the same. What could be interesting as well is that, and we tried this, we did a couple of guest episodes. So you could trial stuff with your podcast and just see, what's the difference? Do my audience prefer me interviewing someone? Do they prefer the solo episodes? Do they prefer the format like me and James have at the moment, where we're just like bouncing ideas off each other? And interestingly, when we looked at ours, there wasn't any noticeable drop-off or increase by having guests.
Yeah.
So we tried it. that's a format our audience clearly still likes. So why wouldn't we do more of that again? We talked about it last night.
Yeah, you get a subsequent benefit from that. Yes, you might not see a tangible difference in listener numbers in the short term, but I think as we'll test this out, as we go through, we were supposed to have, we couldn't do it because logistics changed, but we can crack on with it again now. But we were supposed to have, like, Chris Williamson's head of content was supposed to be coming on, Ant Smith from Diary of a CEO was going to come on.
Yeah.
Sophie from a big advertising network was going to come on. So we can, if we do those episodes and then repurpose the content to make them look and feel like a rock star, we make trailers, we make clips and get them to extend the reach of that as well. That's where I think we'll get a secondary benefit. Will it spike numbers through the roof on YouTube and Spotify and Apple? Maybe not. Most likely, probably not. But will it help extend our reach across LinkedIn, which if you're in the B2B space is a major platform to be on, then I think it would definitely help with that.
Agreed. Last point I want to cover on this one is leveraging those analytics that we talked about. So using data to double down on what's actually working.
Yeah, I think you mentioned it earlier, test one thing. Each time that you sit down and do that, work out what's the one thing. So we did something, we used to do these reports for our clients until one of them said, he literally messaged me, going, bro, I love the effort. I've literally never read a single one. Yeah. Just please don't waste your time. And it used to be when we had, I don't know, we did 15, 20 reports a month, and we used to make them into decks, like pitch decks.
That's what we do. Yeah.
So I was like, right, okay. He said, what would be more useful is for you to give me a 5-minute summary on Loom. And I was like, okay, interesting. So that's what I did. So I literally walked him through the platforms, and all the other clients really liked it as well. So what I would say, though, is... the point being there, when we started to look at it, anytime we used a numeric, so it was like the 5% increase to your net worth or whatever it was, every time there's a number, the downloads increased by 25%. Every single time. So I was like, right, what we need to do then is try and see how often we can shoehorn a number in. If you talk about like the mindset of, personal development or whatever it was, generic title, it's going to be difficult to come up with a numeric there, and I think then you are probably shoehorning it unnecessarily. But if, for example, there was any way to get a numeric in, or could we spin a numeric, we did it, and it just kept driving the download numbers up. But again, you only know that from looking at that data.
Well, as an example, you could go the 3 biggest strategies that are working in personal development right now.
Exactly.
Okay,
yes.
cool.
Yeah.
Okay.
So anytime you could use a number, the downloads increased. So like I say, when you know that stuff, like last night when we were looking at it, and again, we'll do a follow-up episode that breaks this down in more detail. We know the audience primarily for audio is in the UK. And there's not a lot of a lot of the big podcasts, especially the podcasts about podcasting, are US based because it's the biggest podcast market. Yeah. So again, we've got a decision to make. Do we go after that bigger piece of the pie, or do we try and own the space that we're in?
They love an English accent in America.
They do. Thank you, America, for listening to this episode of the podcast. But we might want to go, let's double down and do like how to, the top 3 tactics for UK podcasts. It's going to get rid of 30% of that audience are not going to listen to that episode, but 70% are probably going to listen even more deeply, and will they get more enjoyment, be more engaged? Who knows? We could test and measure.
And also something that I think people probably don't do enough, again, that we briefly mentioned before, is using this data to double down on what's working. So how often, again, do you sit down and look at the marketing that you've done for your podcast, if you've done any marketing for your podcast, not just put out one post a week that's a clip about the podcast, but look at look at all the platforms, look at TikTok, Instagram, LinkedIn, etc. Look at the different types of content that you've put out there, video clips, carousels, quote graphics, all this stuff. What's working, what isn't working. I remember us doing this before, just getting rid of like static graphics because no one was posting it. We were again making it for clients, and it just took one client to go, just to let you know, we don't use any of that. All we're using are the video clips.
Yeah.
And then it was like, okay, carousels are working really well on LinkedIn. Yeah. Okay, can you do this a carousel? Yeah, we can do that instead of what we're doing that. But it's actually doing that, but actually going and checking, is it actually working or not working?
Yeah.
Where is guilty as the next people for doing that, not actually checking, are this new style of thumbnail actually working? Because we're just doing them.
Yeah.
And we've been doing them for 3 months. Are they actually bloody working? Or do we just change one thing here? Yeah. And we're going to do that.
And it's even things like YouTube, for example. When we first started YouTube, it was difficult you couldn't test thumbnails easily. You'd have to run multiple you have to set the video up 3 times, whereas now you've got a beta test functionality. So you can go into YouTube and you can go test and analyze. You click the plus button and you can literally just drop in the 3 thumbnails that you want to do. Now, you might go, well, that's 3 times the work. Yeah, it is, but it's also that improvement that actually you've spent, like this, for example, we've spent 20 odd minutes recording this episode. It's going to take someone an hour to record it. It's going to take somebody another bunch of time to make the assets and stuff. So if we're not testing the little stuff,
I know,
then you're not giving the maximum potential to the long form piece that you're doing. When ultimately, and I say this all the time to people, how often you look at your data? Oh, I ain't got time for that. But you've got an hour a week to do your podcast.
Yeah.
But you haven't got 10 minutes per month to just have a quick scan through and see what's working, because you said it earlier, and it's a brilliant point. I'm glad you made one finally. But otherwise, you keep doing the same thing again and again in the hope that things are going to change.
Yeah.
If your clips are not working, stop doing them.
Yeah.
If your thumbnails are crap, change them.
Yeah.
You're only going to know by testing and measuring.
Yeah, so, that's 4 points for you when it comes to, mastering the art of podcast audience growth. So understand your audience, get platform specific when it comes to your strategies, content format. Look at that, try and test different stuff, and, leveraging analytics and making sure that you are actually checking your analytics in the first place, but then making decisions based on what's working and what's not working. Anything you'd like to add to finish up on this episode?
No, the only thing I would like to say is if you have enjoyed this episode, which I thought was brilliantly curated by Mr. Alex Chisnell, please give it a 5-star review wherever you download your podcast. Leave us a comment on Spotify and let us know in the comments if you've got any further questions on YouTube, and we will answer them in a future episode of How to Start, Grow, and Monetize Your Podcast. Until then, see you then. Bye.
Bye.